Welcome back to Unfair Housing. I'm Morgan Cardinal, and with me today is Alicia Magazoo. Thank you for joining us as we've traveled back in time to explore the history of housing segregation and its impact on our neighborhoods. As we've said each episode, the purpose of this podcast is to help listeners understand how past policies and practices shaped our neighborhoods so we better understand what's necessary to improve housing equity in our present and future. As we've highlighted throughout the podcast, times of economic recovery have historically led to deepening poverty for minorities and vastly inequitable solutions that were offered based on race and skin color. The time between the Civil War and World War I was generally an era of progress for the nation as it embarked on its Reconstruction era. But while this period brought advancement in industry and population growth, it also was a time fraught with segregationist ideas that spread to federal and local government policy, creating a stark wealth divide. Some of the most impactful discriminatory policies and practices related to housing, where creditworthiness was largely irrelevant. What mattered most was the color of one's skin. As Black Americans began to rent and attempt to purchase land, policies and practices were implemented to control where Blacks were allowed to live and consequently what services were available to them. The turn of the 20th century came with extensive discriminatory policies and practices that persisted well into the 1960s when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And while these policies and practices are no longer permitted under the law today, they left lasting impacts that have yet to be remedied. Recall as we moved away from slavery with the addition of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, access to opportunity was still significantly constrained for Black Americans. Programs offered to newly freed slaves often resulted in conditions starkly resembling slavery, and much of the land offered to former slaves was unsuitable for farming. Plus, following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, some of the land given to freed slaves in the South was taken back by the government. And over time, the vast majority of Black-owned farmland was lost, some taken by segregationists through intimidation and violence. Remember the stories of Reverend Isaac Simmons and Luke McElroy, who were both killed in the 1940s for their farmland. Without land, Black Americans struggled to make new lives for themselves, and with employment opportunities that led to slavery-like conditions, it was extremely difficult to build wealth. While federal laws were passed to address the changing times and provide protections for Black Americans, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1866, local efforts were made to restrict the freedom of Black Americans. This originated with the implementation of Black codes, racial zoning, and Jim Crow laws, which controlled the types of jobs Black workers were allowed to have, whether Blacks could own land, where they were allowed to live, eat, shop, and congregate, and many other restrictions on basic day-to-day life, leaving Black families contained to less desirable and often overcrowded neighborhoods. The Civil Rights Act, along with the 14th Amendment, were meant to address these inequities, but enforcement of local law was far more common than the enforcement of federal law. Thus, it was mostly local laws that shaped the daily lives of Black Americans for decades. Federal law was also relatively vague, which left a lot of room for interpretation. For instance, the Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson in May 1896 determined the 14th Amendment didn't protect equal treatment in a social context. Thus, the court upheld a Louisiana law that separated train passengers by race. This decision emboldened local governments to enforce discriminatory laws, which remained commonplace until Plessy was overturned by Brown v. Board of Education nearly 60 years later. Black codes and Jim Crow laws also led to the creation of sundown towns that prohibited the mere presence of a Black person in a town after dark, with violence as a common consequence. The same was true for Black Americans who tried to exercise their right to vote and improve their circumstances. While the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, giving Black citizens the right to vote, local resistance through violence was too often used to prevent Black voters from accessing the ballot box. You may recall our discussion of the 1920 Ocoee Massacre during Season 1. Other measures were taken as well to keep Blacks from voting, such as requiring literacy tests and poll taxes as a condition to vote. These requirements posed a challenge for all poor, less educated Americans, but disproportionately impacted Black Americans who were intentionally denied an adequate education and access to gainful employment due to the color of their skin. As Black Americans migrated from the South to the North and West during the Jim Crow era, discriminatory policies and practices became common across the country. Racial zoning ordinances were enacted to create areas where Black residents were and were not allowed to live. Just prior to the end of World War I, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Buchanan v. Worley in 1917 the use of racial zoning ordinances violated the Constitution. So new tools were more heavily relied upon to keep Black homebuyers out of white neighborhoods. Real estate agents and housing developers added restrictive covenants to warranty deeds that prohibited the sale of property or rental of property to anyone other than members of the Caucasian race. Developed neighborhoods followed suit by implementing similar restrictions in their neighborhood rules. This meant Black families were cut off from most new housing opportunities. Following World War I, the U.S. experienced a time of great prosperity, coming off the Second Industrial Revolution through the Roaring '20s. But for some Black Americans, their prosperity was taken and destroyed. In 1921, Greenwood, a Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, also known as Black Wall Street because of its thriving businesses, was burned to the ground in the Tulsa Race Massacre, which took the lives of a significant number of Greenwood residents, but also stripped any accumulative wealth this Black community had built. No one was ever held accountable, and little to no federal assistance was provided to rebuild. What followed America's age of prosperity, though, was economic instability after the stock market crashed in late 1929. The Great Depression of the 1930s caused many homeowners to fall behind on mortgage payments, prevented new home purchases, and stunted housing development. Following President Franklin D. Roosevelt's election in 1932, he established New Deal programs to assist with recovery. As we discussed throughout seasons 1 and 2, several New Deal programs were designed or implemented in a way that benefited only white Americans and consequently exacerbated conditions in Black neighborhoods. For instance, FDR addressed the need for housing for low to middle income families by using federal dollars to develop housing known as public housing. In its early stages, the majority of public housing was developed for white families. The housing that was built for Black families was segregated and of lower quality. Without enough white tenants to fill in all the units built, though, eventually the program allowed more Black tenants to move in. This, along with other attractive federal programs for homeownership in the suburbs, caused white tenants to flee. What followed was severe neglect by the federal government to maintain the current public housing stock and failure to develop new, quality public housing units, which ultimately led to severely substandard housing for Black tenants. Another New Deal era program created the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, which offered government insurance of residential mortgages, meaning if the borrower didn't make their payments, the federal government would cover a portion of the lender's losses. These loans offered low down payments, low monthly payments, and extended periods of time for repayment. The Veterans Administration, or VA, offered similar terms to military veterans beginning in the mid-1940s. However, neither of these programs were widely available to Black borrowers because the FHA and VA, with the assistance of real estate agents, determined Black borrowers and Black neighborhoods carried too much risk. Both the FHA and VA had language in their governing manuals that stated making loans to Black borrowers or loans to homes in Black neighborhoods was generally prohibited. The risk the FHA and VA manuals referred to was developed from another New Deal program under the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which established color-coded maps based on the racial makeup of a neighborhood. Black neighborhoods were marked in red and labeled too risky to lend in. This became known as redlining. The FHA and VA used these same maps to deny coverage of loans in redlined areas. Without government backing, Black borrowers had difficulty securing a mortgage, and when they did, the terms were generally much less favorable than terms white borrowers could get. And of course, the housing available to them to purchase was segregated and tended to be in less desirable areas. The FHA, again with the assistance of real estate agents, also established the widely believed myth the presence of Black residents in a neighborhood brings down home values and leads to high-risk neighborhoods for lenders. Of course, there was no direct evidence this was the case. Rather, lack of access to federally backed mortgages made prospective Black homebuyers subject to loans with higher interest rates and less favorable terms, and subjected them to a market of risky contract sales which stripped Black Americans of wealth. These types of purchase agreements came with high down payments, high interest rates, high purchase prices, and obviously high monthly payments. Contract buyers were also responsible for all home repairs under the exploitative terms that came with buying a home on contract. Black buyers could not borrow or dip into savings to make home repairs, which were often necessary because the homes were not first inspected or appraised for contract sales. So too often, buyers found themselves struggling to keep up with regular payments and home maintenance due to these factors. As a result of these predatory contracts, high-risk neighborhoods, dubbed so by the FHA, in some instances then became a self-fulfilling prophecy. We'll take a quick break here, and when we return, we'll be joined by Alicia. If you or someone you know is experiencing housing discrimination, or if you would like to schedule a fair housing training, contact our Fair Housing Unit at 800-875-8785. To see if you qualify for other legal assistance, contact the CLS helpline at 800-405-1417, or you can visit our website at www.legalaccessforall.org.
Welcome back. Following the end of World War II, and as the Cold War began, there was a massive shift in America to move out of the cities and into the suburbs. The federal government supported home ownership on the belief it could prevent communism from infiltrating America. So, the National Housing Act of 1949 was passed to allow white families to purchase homes in the suburbs with as little as 5% down and provided a 30-year term to pay off the loan, which also made their monthly payments very affordable. By this time, restrictive covenants had been struck down by the Supreme Court in Shelley v. Kramer, decided in 1948. So when new developments like Levittown in New York were built shortly thereafter, other measures were necessary to keep the neighborhood white. One tactic was to deny applications made by Black buyers. This was the case for Vince Meriday, a Black veteran looking for a place to settle after returning from serving in World War II. The other was to include restrictive covenants in deeds anyway, even though the law prohibited it. These tactics generally worked, which is why Levittown remained and still is predominantly white. But remember, one Black family did purchase a home from a white seller in Levittown. Since the first two tactics failed to keep the Miller family out, the neighbors attempted a third: threats and intimidation. The same tactic that was used on the Wades in Louisville, Kentucky, the Clarks in Cicero, a white neighborhood in Chicago, Illinois, Harry and Harriet Moore in Mims, Florida, the Shorts in Fontana, California, and many, many others. Even fully established Black neighborhoods and towns were not safe from wealth stripping by the government and segregationists. Recall Edmondson, a successful Black town in Arkansas, taken by the state and county government using an illegitimate special assessment, which turned over the entire town to Harold Weaver. Weaver used the Agriculture Adjustment Act, another New Deal program that favored white farmers, to get paid for leaving much of the land vacant after he bulldozed portions of the town and evicted its residents. As it turns out, white neighborhoods were not entirely free from wealth stripping either. While realtors and real estate agents were generally focused on maintaining consistency in neighborhoods, there were some who saw segregation and the market conditions it created as a way to make money. Recall our discussion of blockbusting, whereby a real estate agent or solicitor would convince a white buyer to sell low and quickly on the claim blacks were moving in, and by using the false narrative, their neighborhood would deteriorate and their property values would fall. Because there were so few housing options available to black homebuyers, solicitors could easily resell these properties at a significant markup. This was possible because of practices such as redlining, racial zoning, restrictive covenants, discriminatory HOA rules, and fear of violence, which kept black families in substandard housing. Opening up new inventory to black homebuyers by turning a white neighborhood into a black neighborhood allowed real estate agents to take advantage of both black buyers and white sellers, and the courts allowed it. These conditions also created a market ripe for contract sales to thrive in black and changing neighborhoods. Remember, home purchases made on contract came with higher down payments, higher monthly payments, and were riskier than mortgages. Additionally, contract buyers purchased the home as is, so were responsible for making expensive repairs. Collectively, this often led contract buyers to fall behind on their payments. Because ownership wasn't transferred to a contract buyer until all payments under the agreement were made, contract sellers evicted black families and kept the buyer's investment. All these conditions created blight. The federal and local governments resolved this issue not by investing in these areas to improve the conditions they helped create, but instead used blight as an opportunity to destroy black neighborhoods. This was accomplished through eminent domain for urban development projects and to construct highways. This action pushed black residents into even fewer neighborhoods, exacerbating overcrowded conditions, which only created more blight. Though the Fifth Amendment, which addresses eminent domain, has provisions for some level of compensation for property taken by the government, in many cases, compensation was either not given to black landowners or was under market value. In other instances, compensation was not available because there were no protections for renters who lost their homes when property was taken through eminent domain. Further, blight clearance, urban development, and highway construction were often used to take property in prosperous black neighborhoods as well, and when compensation was given for these takings, it was rarely just and certainly did not take into account future value. Recall the story of Bruce's Beach in California, where a black couple built a thriving resort that was taken by the local government. The compensation provided was nominal, considering the value the land holds today. Thankfully, that story eventually resulted in justice several decades later. But for other areas like Sugar Hill, Black Bottom, and Paradise Valley, along with so many others, justice was never restored. Destruction through urban development projects and highway construction displaced over 1 million families, most of whom were black. And ironically, it was tax dollars that paid for the destruction of these homes. Tax dollars black homeowners were often disproportionately charged. By the 1930s, black landowners saw their property assessments rise as their home values declined, which resulted in a higher tax rate than what was levied against white-owned land. But of course, this disproportionate rate did not come with increased municipal services. Despite paying more than their proportional share, black students received less government spending than white students. Black neighborhoods were often deprived public sidewalks, paved roads, street lights, access to city or county water and sewer lines, and many black neighborhoods lacked fire hydrants or water pipes wide enough to support the pressure needed to extinguish a fire, which only compounded the issue of many black neighborhoods being denied access to fire insurance for decades. Each of these circumstances alone is daunting, but taken together almost seem impossible to overcome. But there were many black Americans who fought for better conditions, who persisted when it seemed as though all hope was lost. And while these efforts also did not often result in the change sought, victories were still achieved. For instance, the Contract Buyers League in Chicago dedicated years to fight discriminatory contract sales. They lost their battles in court, but the attention they drew to the dual housing market eventually led to housing laws that still helped protect against discrimination in lending today. There were also many other civil rights activists and supporters who made strides toward ending housing discrimination. While campaigning for president, John F. Kennedy Jr. emphasized the issue by claiming he would end housing discrimination in federally funded housing programs if elected. Now, we won't debate the extent to which JFK was a civil rights champion, but it's important to note 2 years after taking office, JFK kept his promise. In November 1962, he signed Executive Order 11063, which banned discrimination in federally funded housing programs on the basis of race. This, of course, did not apply to the private housing market, but it did address many of the government agencies we've discussed so far, including the FHA, VA, HUD, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Executive Order 11063 was a first step toward addressing housing discrimination, but the order was somewhat weak because it didn't offer a strong enforcement mechanism for violations. Several actions could be taken, including action by the Attorney General, but the order merely required recipients of federal funding to self-report. There was no individual private right of action, meaning someone who experienced discrimination in housing related to a federally funded program couldn't file a complaint. So more action was needed to address the inequities in housing, which took time. As you'll hear about more next episode, Congress couldn't agree on a federal housing discrimination bill until years later, and not until several impactful events occurred. One was the assassination of JFK. Following JFK's death, now President Lyndon B. Johnson made civil rights a focus of his presidency. During his term, he was able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which offered protections in voting, education, public accommodations, and employment. Housing was not included in this legislation. Again, it took more motivation to get Congress to act. I'm sure you all know the monumental impact Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had on the civil rights movement, but what's discussed less often is his specific influence on the rights of minorities in housing. King dedicated his life to ending discriminatory practices, including ending the dual housing market. He met with both JFK and Lyndon B. Johnson to discuss civil rights many times, including housing discrimination. In 1965, upon receiving an invitation from local activists, King moved to the Lawndale neighborhood in Chicago to experience firsthand the conditions Black residents were living in. In his autobiography, King addressed the experience, saying, "The slum of Lawndale was truly an island of poverty in the midst of an ocean of plenty. Chicago boasted the highest per capita income of any city in the world, but you would never believe it looking out the windows of my apartment in the slum of Lawndale." While in Chicago, King co-led the Chicago Freedom Movement, which was a collaboration of activists with a focus on addressing discrimination in employment, education, and housing. And housing specifically, the group wanted a policy of open housing, which would end segregation and allow Black Americans to choose to live where they wanted and could afford based on equal market conditions. As we'll address in future episodes, and to some degree we've touched on throughout our historic discussion of housing discrimination, where one lives impacts access to better educational opportunities, employment opportunities, and financial stability. So housing was key to gaining equity for all Americans. In classic Martin Luther King style, the movement included nonviolent rallies, marches, and boycotts calling for fair housing. But as we've discussed often, the North and West were not typically more accepting than the South when it came to integrated housing. In fact, following a march in the white neighborhood of Marquette Park in Chicago, King and other marchers were pelted with bottles and bricks, prompting King to remark, "I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I've never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and hate-filled as I'm seeing in Chicago." King's work with the Chicago Freedom Movement is noted as an inspiration to reaching the finish line to passing the Fair Housing Act. Unfortunately, it wasn't until after Dr. King's assassination that ending housing discrimination became more of a priority for Congress. Following King's death, 125 cities, including Chicago and Washington, D.C., erupted in outrage and protests that were far less peaceful than any march led by King. Decades of pent-up frustration had been released. To quell the situation, President Johnson sent federal troops to protect government buildings across the country because America was on fire. The unrest left hundreds of people injured and dozens dead. Something significant had to be done, not just talk, but action. Tune in next time to hear more about President Johnson's interaction with King regarding housing and Congress's response to King's death. Until then, remember this. Upon gaining their freedom, Black Americans were barred by the government, private industry, and segregationists from quality housing and a decent quality of life. From the times of slavery to the time the Fair Housing Act was passed, Black Americans faced a multitude of laws, practices, and behavior that denied them access to housing otherwise available to most white Americans. They faced blatant government prohibition on homeownership and discriminatory laws and practices such as racial zoning, restricted covenants, and HOA rules that prohibited the sale or rental of housing to Black families. Black workers were barred from jobs outside low-wage, hard labor industries. Black renters were charged higher rent for poorly maintained housing. Black borrowers were charged higher mortgage terms for substandard homes. Black homeowners and renters both faced government taking and destruction of their homes and their land with little to no compensation. Black landowners paid higher property tax rates and received far fewer municipal services in return. Black students received an inferior education due to reduced school days, used and outdated books, and less public dollars invested in their schools. Local laws prohibited Blacks from accessing public facilities, and even when those laws were struck down, local governments often closed facilities rather than integrate them. Black voters who tried to vote to better their circumstances were met with violence or unfilled promises. Black families seeking the American dream were threatened with burning crosses, stones thrown through their windows, and were violently forced to vacate or were killed through home bombings and acts of arson. And they faced a failed judicial system that didn't often follow through with ensuring equal justice under the law. These are the practices that shaped our neighborhoods and that created a stark racial wealth divide that persists today. In 2020, the home ownership rate for white Americans was approximately 72%, but was only about 43.5% for Black Americans. The median wealth of Black households was approximately $24,000 compared to around $189,000 for white households. Past discriminatory practices made the passage of the Fair Housing Act imperative to prevent future harm. However, as we'll draw attention to often in future episodes, correcting the damage caused by past practices is far more difficult than it was to implement them. Next episode, we'll dive further into what finally led the federal government to respond to housing discrimination by passing the Fair Housing Act, as well as discuss what protections the Act provides. And you'll meet two new CLS staff members, Nicole Carrero, the manager of our Fair Housing Unit, and Vanessa Crisostomo, one of our Fair Housing staff attorneys. For now, thank you for joining us this week. And don't forget, if you're enjoying the show, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you'll always know when new episodes are released, and share our information with your friends and family. Also be sure to follow Community Legal Services on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We look forward to having you back next time.